Hello and welcome to IR Thinker, where international affairs are discussed. I'm Martin Zubko. Today we're going to speak about chemical and biological weapons, and that has two reasons. The first one is the conflict in Ukraine, and the second point is the Middle East. And all these two conflicts, they force us to think about which weapons are used. And there are also many questions. Are there chemical or biological weapons being used in those conflicts or not? So today I have a great expert on chemical and biological weapons, Dr. Brett Edwards. Hello, Brett.
Hello there. Well, thank you very much for having me on the show, Martin.
Dr. Edwards is a senior lecturer in security and public policy at the University of Bath. He has a range of research interests falling at the intersection of security, non-proliferation, and responsible innovation. Most of his work focuses on chemical and biological weapons and non-proliferation. So, Brett, let's start with the first question, and we can go a little bit, in a general terms. Is it possible to say who has chemical and biological weapons nowadays? What sort of quality or quantity? And also there is one tricky question, and this is like, which states are producing or have been producing those weapons? And are there also states that are just buying those weapons?
Okay. Well, yes. I mean, let's start with, I think, one of those things that needs to be said. For most people, chemical and biological weapons are an unusual thing to think about. And to be frank, there's a good reason for that. It's because they are weird, they are esoteric, and in part that's because of the success of Prohibition, which has emerged from the 1960s onwards. And so today, what often happens is you have incidents or events where suddenly people are hearing these things mentioned again, and it's almost like seeing a dinosaur walking down the street. You're kind of like, where has this reference come to, and what's the reality of it? So I guess with chemical weapons, the first thing to say is that we're in a very different world to where we were during the Cold War, where there were massive stockpiles and large proliferation to numbers of states who had dedicated programs. They had battlefield-ready stocks ready to go, a wide variety of weapons developed for strategic, tactical, and subvert purposes. But today, we're in a situation where we have a large prohibition treaty, disarmament treaty. I think 193 states are members to that. I think about 98% of the global population live in countries where these are banned. And 100% of the stockpiles that have been declared publicly have been destroyed. So this extends to your battlefield chemical weapons. There are some issues there, of course. So the treaty that was developed to prohibit chemical weapons, it was a classic arms control disarmament treaty. It was designed to reduce stocks of large scale stockpiles of chemical weapons which had emerged during the Cold War, and to stop other states developing them. It means that whole regime is set up primarily to verify destruction and to increase transparency and verify that states aren't clandestinely producing and maintaining stocks. And that, on that side of things, on the large scale side of things, we're doing pretty well. I mean, we think it's probably North Korea. There may be a couple of other sort of holdout states that might have stocks. In other ways, however, there are a few fringe issues. So the first thing is undeclared stocks, which tend to be smaller. So Russia, for example, thanks to the tourists that visited Salisbury a few years ago now, and other incidents internationally, we're reasonably confident that Russia is maintain a small clandestine program, but that isn't focused on battlefield use. That's focused on assassination and poisoning and those types of things. In addition, the other issue is that many sort of security analysts, and much of our knowledge of this comes from, for example, national security assessments, believe that it's potentially possible for states to decide to start producing chemical weapons and alter and manipulate their existing civilian infrastructures to do that. So that's a scenario that does concern some analysts. That's called breakout potential. But historically, you don't see that really happening unless states are in a very kind of serious conflict already, and it's seen as a kind of strategy of last resort. At the same time, the other type of issue is, as I say, this smaller use, which isn't necessarily these sort of Cold War era battlefield chemical weapons, but it might be more subvert or covert use of poisons or industrial chemicals and those types of things as part of terrorism or asymmetrical conflict. And so where we are today is that market is closed, and the no state admits publicly to having these things. And we could be reasonably confident that great powers would be eager, whatever side of the world they currently sit, to highlight and point to situations where other states might be violating. So I think the big strategic battlefield use is a concern from the olden days, but today we're faced with this problem of reemergence, and that reemergence will look different to how it looked in the Cold War in some respects.
And is it possible to describe how those weapons look like? Like, for some people, it's difficult to imagine, like, what is chemical weapon? Like, is it like a bomb? Is it like the little bottle with the liquid, or how does it work? Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, the best way of thinking about it is that chemical weapons fill like a niche in the evolutionary sense. And so at different points in history, states have proactively sought to develop specially designed weapon systems. And so it's probably worth just going for that tour quickly. So 1915, you see the development basically of improvised large chlorine cylinders, which are opened, and these produce over a huge front. And these produce huge clouds of chlorine. And that's an example of the first major use of chemical weapon on the battlefield. At the same time, in order to kind of overcome the situation that states found themselves in the First World War, we saw experimentation with a wide range of agents, some of which became almost famous. We still recognize them today. This is mustard, phosgene, and these types of agents, but also with a wide range of delivery systems. And this included basically mortars. It included large and shells of various size with various types of fill. And that continued to be the case for a long time. And this was battlefield tactical use. In the 1920s, with the advance of air power, we also started seeing the emergence of aerially delivered chemical bombs. And at that point, the main thing was mustard. That was the main one that was kind of stockpiled in the interwar Second World War era. At the end of the Second World War, the Nazis also, with the advance of rocketry, started exploring how to put a new generation of nerve agents they developed, which included things like sarin, SOMON, onto rockets. And then you also saw chemical mines and all sorts of things starting to develop, but they weren't typically fielded. In China, in Manchuria, we saw the Japanese develop and utilize a range of munitions. This included things as small as glass grenades, which contained agent, which could be thrown, up to more conventional, larger battlefield munitions. During the Cold War, we saw the advent of what was known as like strategic chemical and its sister project, strategic biological. And this then was continual advancement in different forms of battlefield delivery, and also experimentation and practice of covert operations involving smaller types of toxin and poison. But then we also saw the emergence of large missile systems and the idea of the chemical WMD. So this idea of you being able to blanket civilian areas, cities, launch sites, airfields with huge amounts of an agent, and particularly persistent agents, such as later would be VX would be there, one of the kind of things we think about. And during the Cold War, we saw new agents and new weapon systems. Fortunately, in the Second World War, we didn't see large-scale use in Europe of chemical weapons. So we saw stockpiles, preparation for development, strategies for deployment. And in the Cold War, we saw development and stockpiling. But again, we didn't see large-scale use, or rather, we saw a number of isolated examples of use on the battlefield, particularly, but these tended to be with Second World War era agents. And then towards the end of the 80s, we saw more after the Iraq-Iran war, which saw large-scale use of a wide range of agents. We saw attempts in the US and collaboration with Russia to basically prohibit and close down much of the kind of emphasis on strategic battlefield weapons. We saw the emergence of the arms control treaties. And this then is interesting in a sense of, in some respects, some aspects of development were frozen in time by the effectiveness of prohibition. And so on the one hand, prohibition has been great, and it's been fantastic because it's stunted the development of these weapon systems. But at the same time, there's always the potential that we will see a recombination of new technologies, new delivery systems with traditional older agents. So things like drones are a concern, particularly terrorism. And indeed, terrorism is where the main concern is today. So often that's not necessarily incredibly sophisticated programs, but it's often getting hold of or producing agents that were developed specifically for battlefield use because of their physical characteristics and how poisonous they are, and then combining them with new forms of delivery systems. So, and we'll get into some history of terrorism, I guess, in a few moments' time.
When you mentioned that those stocks were destroyed during their history,
yes,
like was there any international committee or sort of
yes,
institution that was checking that it was really happening, not only on the paper but also like
yes,
in the real practice?
Yeah, so you had the Chemical Weapons Convention, which was negotiated and agreed in the mid-1990s. And part of the terms of that were states declared their stocks, and there was various processes of verification of destruction in which inspectors were there. There were mutual visits. And then this architecture of the OPCW, this is the organization established under the treaty, allows for a range of different things. So it allows for, one of the most important aspects is certain types of facility which exist for civilian purposes ostensibly, may produce or handle or have the ability to produce agents which could be used as part of weapon development. And so they are subject to independent on-site inspection. So that's a really good way of increasing transparency. And there's also various mechanisms within the OPCW system to investigate allegations of non-compliance or so on. And while that treaty, as we'll get into in relation to things like Syria, has faced some real challenges, I think what's important to remember is it's made the idea of a large state being able to covertly produce for battlefield use large stocks of these weapons increasingly unrealistic. And I think that's one of the key legacy benefits we've had from that regime.
How those weapons fit in modern military doctrines or strategies? Because we always heard about military strategy. What's your military strategy? How it's developing and what are the innovations over there? So we have like many weapons, many modern systems. We even go to the cyberspace as the next domain of battlefield. So how the chemical and biological weapons fit in this narrative?
Yeah, sure. So since the end of the 1970s, 1980s, you saw basically the disavowal of offensive chemical weapon use. And so increasingly states no longer planned to deploy these things as part of conventional warfare. One of the last things to go was the ability of a state to respond, usually with standoff chemical attacks by air, if they were either attacked by chemical weapons or in some other scenario. So today, chemical weapons for the vast majority of states around the world, nearly all the states, are basically something they expect to be hit with, potentially, or prepare for, or expect that, or it's reasonable to prepare or expect that, but not deliver. Historically, chemical weapons, a wide range of sorts were developed. And of course, it behooves all states to be aware of the potential of re-emergence from an adversary or a sub-state actor. Some of the agents were used to kill. Some were used for aerial denial on the battlefield. You also have agents that were designed to target livestock, agriculture, If you think about the Vietnam War, Agent Orange was employed to defoliate large areas of the jungle, all prohibited now. And so there's this wide history of the wide range of niches that chemical weapons found. But today, I think the only real niche it has is what we would call, covert action. This is assassination primarily, or forms of terrorism. Or in some cases, as we'll get to in relation to Russia, we may also see covert grey area actions where these weapons are used to cause terror or for other political purposes. But the idea of force-on-force chemical weapon use, for example, is not really with us anymore, if that makes sense.
When you said that states are more focusing on receiving attack or receiving those chemical biological weapons, how do you evaluate the stage? How ready are we? Are we ready to face those weapons? And in these times, when we are dealing with so many threats and challenges, do we focus on sort of being ready to face the chemical and biological weapons in terms of the national strategy, perhaps NATO military, strategy, or how does it work in today's world?
Well, I think it's a complicated one in part. So if we're talking about specific types of preparation and defense against chemical and biological attacks on armed forces, where, all forces around the world engage in defensive work. And that's in part because they know, particularly if they're stationed on certain bases internationally, there's a risk always that they could be attacked by an unconventional weapon. And so the training on that is very good generally. We've had decades and decades experience from the Cold War to develop defenses against different things. And so I think in the armed forces, the vast majority of people will have some form of CBRN training. Likewise with policing and then those types of areas. It's not necessarily the most glamorous thing. It's not the most exciting, but training in how to put masks on, how to decontaminate, that sort of thing is, we've been doing that for a very long time. Then the other type of question relates to things like government response. So how to deal with large scale incidents. And of course, there are some overlaps between chemical and biological and other forms of mass casualty or political types of acts of terrorism and those types of things. And certainly, I think in the UK, for example, the case that we're still learning from and taking much from is what happened in Salisbury, which was, of course, a very small incident. And I think the truth of the matter is, and I think this is really important to remember, is that the best defense against and prevention of re-emergence isn't just control of proliferation. It's ensuring that you have the capability to absorb and respond, because it shifts that calculation. Because, to be frank, I think some periods in history the threat of chemical and biological terrorism is overplayed, and sometimes it's kind of ignored. But it's always worth remembering that the terrorist group, for example, are always having to make evaluations. Usually, your first thought isn't chemical or biological warfare. Your first thought is explosives, and those types of things. So I think it's really important not only to have a good defense and preparedness, but to communicate that and to make it clear that basically you might get in the headlines, there might be a bit of public shock initially, but in terms of material damage, we can respond. And I think that's a logic that's kind of there now in terms of defense and response in policing and in the military.
And when we were speaking about those instances, like you said, terrorism might be one of them, which might use chemical and biological weapons. When we switch back to the state actors, how did the states justify having chemical or biological weapons? Or if we maybe go a little bit deeper, when we had some attack or some usage of chemical and biological weapons, can we justify that? Or that was, crossing all the red lines?
In thinking about chemical weapons, there's a few ideas that usually come out almost instantly when you talk about them. The first one is that there's somehow some stigma against them, that they're a specifically abhorrent form of warfare. And that's an association which is relatively cross-cultural. That doesn't mean its source is cultural. Its source, I think, is primarily historic, but there's that dimension to it. And at the same time, others would argue that part of the reason we don't have chemical weapon programs today is because states basically realized that, well, powerful states realized that they didn't get that much advantage from them. In terms of their competitors, if both sides had them, it just made it kind of worse for both people. And at the same time, the risk of proliferation was really high. Like these things, once we started getting them at the end of the Second World War, into war years, programs proliferated quickly. And so I think in part the norm around chemical weapons emerged primarily from the First World War. There was stigma about them and there was initial denial about use, but you get that of many forms of new weapon use. But what happened was in the interwar years, on the one hand, you had lots of victims of things like mustard and phosgene coming home, and people saw this and they saw how horrible these weapon systems were and the effects of them. They also realized that chemical warfare was used, and there was this promise in both Germany and in the West as well that it would somehow win the war. It didn't. It just became another routinized aspect of the conflict. And so on the one hand, you had people clearly suffering the effects. You also had a realization that this wasn't necessarily a battlefield winning weapon. But at the same time, in the interwar years, we see the fact that states realize, well, it's here now. So if we need to develop defenses, we need to develop an ability to deter attack. So often the main justification for investing in offensive work, in fact, it wasn't always clear where the line was to say we need a credible deterrent response capability. And so, for example, in the Second World War, the US, the UK had very large stocks of particularly mustard, which was there, and it was communicated very clearly to the Axis powers that if they employed, that there would be a response. At the same time, it was also communicated that the West wouldn't use it first. And in that context, it was this threat of like-for-like retaliation, which basically kept it off the table. And fortunately for us, neither side saw a moment at which it could really leverage an advantage from employing it. And the other thing that emerges out of that interwar year in particular, and the Second World War, is that it becomes clear that you can actually usually relatively well defend troops. So you can prepare and train troops, which can make it much less effective to apply chemical weapons or use chemical weapons against troops. Civilians is much more difficult, and particularly wide area aerial use. And so in the interwar year, we saw fascist states, Spain, Italy, utilize mustard in particular as part of colonial counterinsurgency, basically in the Italian case, an invasion of Ethiopia. And it just showed that civilians are very vulnerable to these things. And this was a real concern in the interwar years. And in the Second World War, Germany and Britain were firebombing each other's cities. And we knew that if one side used chemical weapons, it would be back on one of their cities within a matter of days. So deterrence was part of that. So I think in relation to chemical weapons, they have this kind of characteristic in this stigma, and the debates tend to focus on how effective are they, how well can we defend against them, this stigma idea. But I don't think either on its own has really shaped the history. It's been a kind of these have all played a role in what the niche of the weapon has been in different points in history.
When we mention that the states, they were destroying those stocks of chemical and biological weapons, automatically there is a question of cooperation or security cooperation. Yes. So how can we describe the impact of chemical and biological weapons on security cooperation? And are there any instances where states got together and they basically, did few steps for, better world?
Well, in many respects, the Biological Weapons Convention comes in 1972, I think. And this was the example of the first treaty to comprehensively prohibit the development, stockpiling, use of the entire class of weaponry. And of course, but what you've got to do is to put this in the context, and there's two ways to look at it, right? So one is, well, it could be banned because it wasn't seen to be of that much value, or basically they were going to ignore the treaty. Russia did ignore the treaty. But certainly, I think Western powers quite early on realized that any short-term benefit from these weapons would quickly be outweighed by the ability of these weapons to proliferate. Plus, with chemical weapons in particular, it was quite a destabilizing factor when thinking about nuclear arms control as well. It became this kind of potential stepping stone. That, yeah. In terms of collaboration, then, there was a drive to prohibit these things within powerful states, tempered with this, we need to ensure before we move to full disarmament, we can be confident. But of course, in reality, the US disarmed knowing it had nuclear weapons. And the US in 1968, and it was comfortable knowing that there may be some costs from disarming, but it was probably, in the longer term, in its better interests. Of course, a lot of people campaign for good moral arguments as well, and all those sorts of things. During, as well, towards the end of the Cold War, it also became clear that, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, there was a lot of collaboration between the East and West, because all of a sudden you had a situation where former biological or chemical weapon engineers were out of work. And, so there was a lot of work on trying to prevent the proliferation of both people, expertise, and materials. And so you saw collaboration there. And ironically, some of that collaboration continued up until today, very recently. And in fact, some of it, ironically, has then been demonized by Russia as an example of US imperialist grabs on Ukraine and those types of things. But yeah, likewise, we've seen other instances of collaboration. The big one would be the disarmament of Syria. The Syrian regime employed chemical weapons. I think it's reasonable to believe that in Ghouta and in several instances and run up to that. The issue was then that Russia basically intervened and said, look, and with Syria said, look, we'll get Syria to join chemical weapons treaty. We'll get them to disarm. And so for whatever reason that happened, one good thing that came out of it was that a large proportion of Syrian chemical weapons were destroyed. Depending on if you speak to Syrian or Western sources, it was either all of them or most of them. And regardless of the politics around that, the fact that during wartime we did see collaboration to disarm Syria is certainly relatively unprecedented. The broader historical and political consequences of that are much more complicated. And the reasons why chemical weapons became a focal point of that collaboration, you could also discuss and have sorts of interesting debates about. But certainly what is the case is, for better or for worse, that shared stigma of chemical weapons and this idea that there could be a specific problem that could be dealt with in that conflict did allow some collaboration between Russia and the US. I mean, both had their reasons for engaging in that process. They weren't primarily interested in chemical weapons. We can assume it was just one of many considerations in that conflict. But certainly, at certain historical key points, chemical weapons in particular seem to have a characteristic which kind of mean that they become focal points of agreement or discussion. In saying that, I mean, it's international organizations. So you can make yourself feel good by looking at statements in some aspects of the OPCW where everyone agrees how bad these things are, or you can look at some of the other meetings within that organization where you're seeing mudflinging and silly, spurious accusations and all the normal kind of tools of the trade of disruptive diplomacy. So yes, it has an importance. That importance sometimes allows for very specific types of collaboration, and that usually is either moments of moral crisis, or it's a moment where there's seen to be a joint strategic value to doing something on a very narrow problem. So that's why the specialness of chemical weapons does come into play in those types of scenario usually.
Was it more difficult to ban chemical or biological weapons, or basically those two weapons were banned in a similar way? Because one of the questions from the students that always is there, it's like, do we have more chemical or biological weapons? So if we have more, it's more difficult to destroy, more difficult to ban, maybe to agree. So based on your research, what was the political will to do it in both sectors, in chemical and biological? How would you describe that process?
Well, it's worth remembering that in the 1960s, there was basically a transnational attempt to ban both chemical and biological weapons at the same time. Okay, this makes sense in a sense because it came in the wake of the rapid advances in the field of nuclear weapons. So as a WMD, these things, they were potentially destabilizing. They were definitely not as proven or didn't have the destructive potential. And there was a proliferation risk. So, and also humanitarian arguments almost built in. And then pragmatically speaking, I think it was the late 60s, mid 60s, it was decided that it would be easier at that point in history to prohibit biological than chemical. And the main reason was because a lot more states had large stocks of chemical. A lot more states relied on chemical weapons as a last line of defense. Also, there were dyads in the Middle East where one side, you had to get both sides to kind of agree that it was tempting. And so the cynic would argue, well, the biologicals were, the British actually made the suggestion, but it basically meant that the biological agents, that is to say, diseases, infectious diseases, so pathogens, viruses, and also toxins, which ended up being covered by both treaties, but we don't get into that today, was banned first. So that was good. However, less good, they never really agreed a verification system, which they still haven't. And so they had a treaty. It was very good, this treaty, that as a symbol of what could be possible. It was violated almost instantly in terms of Russia went off, or Soviet Union went off and developed a vastly expanded program after the negotiation of the treaty. But it did reinsert the illegality and immorality of these weapons. So that biological one was easier to negotiate in a sense because I think there was less skin in the game at the point it was negotiated. Very reductive perspective on it. And also states were more dependent on chemical weapons. The chemical weapon situation, and part of the reason we never got verification, one was political, because it would have required quite invasive inspections and also proprietary. So if you're like a biotech company, you don't necessarily want scientists from other countries wandering around your facility because they may steal stuff, basically. And so that's always been a concern and part of the reason it hasn't worked out. And also because on the biological side, well, yeah, initially it was fine because it was quite strategic, large scale programs. But as we failed to establish verification, it's also become clear that the scope of facilities that might require investigation and those sorts of things was also quite broad. Anyway, but yeah, so on the chemical side, it was clearer what should be inspected. It was clearer, and even though there was this problem of dual use like there is in biological, there was the impetus, and it was just the right moment in the Cold War where, or post Cold War, where there was this collaboration between Russia and the West. Also, let's remember, right? So after this Cold War, Russia has a problem because it has these huge stocks of chemical weapons. It goes off and destroys some of them that it doesn't really want anymore. Other states have also inherited chemical weapons they don't want, and they have these stocks that they don't want anymore. Also, if you're sat in Russia, you realize that some of your neighbors may have inherited chemical weapons, and you don't want them to have them anymore either. And so basically, there's this complex situation where, the emphasis becomes upon declaring and destroying stocks, many of which are not that useful anymore anyway. And also this idea of preventing the proliferation of the capability to produce chemical weapons to smaller, less powerful states. And so in the negotiation of the Chemical Weapons Convention, a wide range of people can support it for a wide range of reasons. And because of the emphasis on verification and the success in getting that from the outset of those discussions, it was much more focused on the practical questions of how do we inspect facilities to make sure they're not making chemical weapons? How do we ensure transparency? which was a very different situation to the Biological Weapons Convention, which didn't do verification. So it was, if you think about it, if you look at the documents for the Biological Weapons Treaty, it's like, but the chemical weapons one is vast, with vast annexes and those sorts of things, because it's a much more operational treaty. But yeah, so in terms of banning and disarmament, different types of challenge. And in terms of ensuring re-emergence, I think there is some convergence, and we'll get to that in a few moments' time, I guess.
Naturally, there is a question like, what are the challenges when you want to detect those weapons? Yes. Because when you mention, inspections, stocks, and all those agreements, that's quite clear. But how does it work? Like, a person comes to a facility, or can you detect this distantly? Like you have some satellite images, or how does it work based on your research?
So it depends. So basically, let's do it. The best way is to do it as an example, right? So you're sat in a state, okay? We'll call you state X, and you decide you want to clandestinely develop a large military stockpile of chemical weapons. So you need to get the munitions. You also need to get the agents produced. You can't import them because of global export laws. You're going to struggle to find countries where you can export from. You can also be pretty sure that the countries that would supply it to you are being monitored by other great power international security institutions. So more than likely, you'll say, okay, we're going to develop domestically. Okay. Now, say, for example, you wanted to produce some of the classic warfare agents, which are the ones that actually would work and that are well understood. This might be nerve agents. It could even be sort of things like mustard. It's very likely that you're then going to have to indigenously produce the precursors if you can, or find a way around. But either way, you're going to be importing a large amount of material, and you're going to be the factory sites also produce a large amount of waste. Now, as vast majority of states are in the Chemical Weapons Convention, it's very likely that your government would need to report that facility. And they might not. They might decide, well, okay, so we're going to set up a facility quietly. We won't subject it to the OPCW. We won't let it be inspected, obviously. But the second you start doing that, once foreign international intelligence services get a whiff of that, all of a sudden, you're attracting attention at that site. So even the act of trying to circumvent the control systems, it makes it difficult. So the best way of thinking about this is this idea of this synthesis of a web of oversight and detection mechanisms. So in terms of detecting those sites, it would be done about what sort of thing are they buying. And if the OPCW were there, they'd be asking and speaking to people on site. They'd be looking at their records about what sort of products are made. And these are scientists they send. So they understand and often work in chemical industries. And they'd very quickly be able to work out what you're making. And if you're making something which has no market because it's incredibly lethal, maybe a precursor, then the finger of suspicion comes to you, right? If you're producing something which, if you say you're producing something for a beauty market, but you're not. And so it's these kind of things. Even if you were, say you weren't a member of the OPCW, in fact, you're a bit of a rogue state. And so if you're in North Korea, for example, there's other ways as well. So one way, of course, is the classic, by all forms of intelligence. So defectors and those types of things. States also monitor imports and exports, and there's various forms of data they can use for that. Increasingly, we've seen a returning interest. Ironically, it seems like a new thing of like open source investigation, where you're looking at aerial photos and those sorts of things. Of course, we know that aerial photos in intelligence is a very long history. I've just been reading listen to that lovely series on the Cold War and the nuclear weapons, and U2s and all those sorts of things. But today as well, there's increasing work basically where you can look at certain facilities and look for certain types of things. The big problem on the bio side is a vaccine production facility, which produces vaccine industrial scale from the air, is going to look very, very similar to a biological weapon production facility. And so again, it's this combination of things. And this is why it's interesting, I think, to realize that you can always circumvent, you can get round, but these things are always done clandestinely and clandestinely today, not just secret, as in like, in the restrictions we have on conventional weapon programs and the secrecy around those trade secrets, but they have to be usually, to some extent, largely internally secret within the country, and also obviously internationally secret. And the good thing about that is it makes it really hard to do. We've seen this historically, that in whether we're talking about state programs or terrorist groups, this requirement for secrecy, both internally and externally, it gets in the way. I mean, it's really hard to do. And that's not to say that you can't produce kind of improvised and low, sort of less deadly types of stuff. But the idea of sophisticated or large programs, it's really hard to do. And so that's one. Yeah, we forget very often that there is a threat of re-emergence of these things, but we've inherited many latent oversight and regulatory systems which do at least keep these things marginal. We can't ever prevent these things re-emerging completely, but in terms of keeping them marginal, enough people are watching, basically.
Brett, let's simulate, or let's think theoretically that those weapons were used at a certain, distance or territory, and now we have a location, and it's suspicious, because we might think the weapons were used at the location. What are the long environmental impacts, or sort of like impacts generally, when someone used those weapons? So can we detect after the usage of those weapons that those weapons were used? How complicated is it? Maybe you have some examples from the history where those locations were inspected and people found certain things, certain data about it.
Yeah, so there's two types of scenario there. The first one is you perhaps there's a conflict and there's accusations of chemical weapon use, and so in that situation, the most important thing usually is access. So let's for a moment put aside the political dimensions of confidence and protection of the individuals going there, but just say technically. So very often you want to have access to the munition, and then you will be able to try and get soil samples, tissue samples from victims, and those types of things. And that task in itself, if you have the access, is straightforward. And that relates to the majority of chemical weapons. And even with biological weapons, there's also, viruses, bacteria, and other types of nasties. There's a very different process involved in that, but there's various techniques that can also be used to examine source, how common is this illness where we are, so more circumstantial evidence. There's also more genetic testing and stuff, which can be done in certain scenarios. But confirming it's happened, if you have access, is relatively straightforward. And that's for good reason. In part, it's because, we've had 50 years of state militaries needing to be confident if these weapons are there or not when they're in certain battlefield situations. And so that's been one of the reasons we've had, a lot of investment in good detection technology. Likewise, we've also seen international level diplomatic level, we've had this push for international systems where the UN can basically send an investigation team in, and they have certain skills and standing capacity which allow them to do that. And the biggest issue there is never technical, it's political. Because if you can get the samples, if you can get the munition, if you can get to the area, it's doable. But very often it's political obstacles that prevent that happening.
And if there is a case, let's say in 5 years, that the state use those weapons, either chemical or biological, are there any international sanctions that are automatically applied? Yes. Or it depends all on the political will of big powers or international system? How does it work?
Yeah, so there's a combination. It's always this thing. It's realpolitik. So, but in terms of things, so for example, the US, I think the US, I'm not a US constitutional expert, but as I understand it, in US law, if a state is accused of using chemical weapons, they're required by law to impose some sort of response to that. But sadly, there is contingent factors. So chemical and biological weapon use, without a doubt, attracts more attention, usually speaking, than other forms of conventional human rights violation, war crime, and those types of things. Internationally, there are a range of mechanisms that states can choose to use. This might be, but historically, we've seen that, of course, power politics gets in the way. And that's always been the case with chemical and biological weapons. So when we've always seen with chemical weapon use, I mean, I'm just reading at the moment a story from the 1930s, which is the use of chemical weapons in Ethiopia by the Italian fascist regime, 1936, where there was a prohibition on the use of chemical weapons, and that because of this state's geostrategic position in between two emerging conflicted between the West and the Axis powers, there was a hesitancy on both sides to call them out for using chemical weapons or the illegal invasion more generally. And that happens. I mean, these sacrifices are made. I think the thing to remember is, the way I think about this is, or the thing to check myself on this is that at the moment chemical and biological weapons used or become involved, they seem to be the most important political consideration, but they never are. So the decision they may create a moment or a crisis, but it's always the broader historical, ideational processes which come into play. I think one shortcoming of certain ways of thinking about the chemical weapon norm, for example, is some people tend to argue that chemical weapon use almost presents, from leaders, almost prevents this kind of knee-jerk, visceral response. Okay? It's an emotional thing. But a lot of wars like that, it's horrible. And horrible things happen, horrible forms of atrocity happen. And I think more realistically, it's realizing that there is specific prohibitions, there are specific technical means. As a technical problem, it's well understood, and there are means there. But as a political issue, it's usually one of many things that are happening. And usually in scenarios where you're seeing chemical and biological weapons used, there's usually a much broader threat from another actor. It's happening in a conflict where other horrible things are also happening. And so it's that interesting thing. They do attract attention and focus analytically, but they are distinctive in a sense, but they're not in a sense distinctive politically. They're one of many, and that's indifferent both as a weapon, as a moral thing. And I find that really hard to get my head around, right? Because when people most want usually to discuss chemical weapons is the moment at which they've been treated as a pivotal thing. But usually it's that thing where you're like, well, it's a focusing point perhaps, but it's not a driving force.
Right. Brett, what about Ukraine and ongoing conflict? Many people, many experts, they always think, Ukraine used to be a part of the Soviet Union, and maybe there were some stocks of chemical or biological weapons. Maybe they were destroyed, maybe not. The other camp is thinking the Russians are using, the chemical weapons in a battlefield. And now we have like two narratives, and people are afraid, people are worried, because when you use chemical or biological weapons, as you said, there are some consequences. So do we have any updates about this topic? Can we clarify how the Ukraine is at the moment in terms of chemical and biological weapons?
Sure. Okay, so there's a few sides to this, and I'm going to try and go through them systematically. Let's start with the Ukraine. Okay, so the Ukraine is a member of both the Biological Weapons Convention and the Chemical Weapons Convention. It's allied with the US. Okay, and the US has invested huge amounts of money and resource in previous decades, initially to help with demilitarization, but also to prevent the risk of the misuse of chemistry and biology, the development of biological weapons in that country. And this was all part of the Soviet legacy. And I talked about that broader scheme of preventing scientists falling into usually Middle Eastern government hands who at that point in the 80s and 90s wanted to develop chemical weapons. Ukraine does not have chemical or biological weapons. Okay. This is not, and it's one of those difficult things. So the only way often responding to this is to respond to the specific accusations that are made. But the specific accusations that have been made have been bonkers. So you know the sort of thing where you read it as someone with a basic understanding and you go, no, that doesn't make any sense. So let's look at one of the narratives that Russia have pointed out. One is the idea that Ukraine have biolabs in their state, which somehow are making biological weapons of a non-determinate nature. Well, first of all, a lab doesn't make a biological weapon. A lab isn't where these things are made. You talk about scale of use. You would have a production infrastructure to do that. If we assume, for argument's sake, say they're just saying these are small, secretive, small labs producing, small weapons that are going to be used to cause terror and destruction, okay, on their own territory. Anyway, the labs they're talking about, Russia have hundreds of. The West have hundreds of labs. And when I say hundreds, I mean, they may have a few of the kind of most secure, like BSL-4 it's called, where you have very secure laboratories where you're working with the most dangerous pathogens. But Russia have loads of them. Most states do. In fact, the reason that Russia could respond to the COVID outbreak was because it had its own high security laboratories and infrastructure to do this. So it's a bit rich pointing to Ukraine for having labs. That's a strange thing. But it's not strange. It's also part of the fact that Russia has beef with the US because they know that the West has supported Ukrainian labs. And of course, that links to geopolitics, right? So that's why that accusation's there. And it's mad. It makes no sense. In relation to chemical weapons, the Russians have also claimed that Ukraine has used or has chemical weapons. There may, of course, always have been incidents of isolated use. I don't know. I'm not aware of any that are very convincing. But what I mean is now, in most modern conflicts today, it's not unlikely or unusual to get someone doing something improvised that happens, chlorine or other chemicals. It's war. But in terms of them actually having stocks, no, makes no sense. And in terms of them using things like tear gas, again, I've not seen any convincing allegations of that. Tear gas is prohibited as a weapon of warfare, but is not, it's illegal to use tear gas in warfare, as with other chemical weapons. I can't get into how that is, but we'll take that as a given. And there's no evidence Ukraine are doing that either. And of course, considering that Ukraine are running a war where they're incredibly dependent on Western support, the deployment of chemical weapons against the Russians would be bonkers. It would be absolutely the last thing you'd want to do if you want to garner support from Western states. So is there capability in Ukraine? No. Is there intent? Not for a large scale use. Of course, disinformation is potential. Let's look at the Russian side. So on the Russian side, do Russia have large-scale battlefield chemical? Do Russia have chemical weapon stocks? No, very unlikely. They may have stocks of various chemicals which have traditionally been used for riot control, which aren't very nice, which again are legal to use on the battlefield. But all states have access to things like tear gas and those types of things. And they may also have agents which you could call tear gases, but are slightly more dangerous, like chloripyrifos. Have Russia been using these? So Russia, we don't think, has a large conventional chemical weapon munition stock. We do think it is reasonable to believe that they've been using tear gas. There's many videos, there's many documentary evidence. It's likely been exaggerated because it's war, but objectively, it has been happening. Have they used worse stuff than tear gas? Potentially. Has there been evidence of that? No, not that I'm aware of yet. The Ukrainians have argued that perhaps chloripyrifos was used, which is a World War I era agent, and that may have been used. Again, I haven't seen evidence of that yet, but it makes, from my logic, the logic of it, from my perspective, is that Russia has stocks of tear gas. It sent riot-controlled troops into Ukraine. It's not surprising that they're using this stuff. And yes, it is a contravention of international law to do so. But that doesn't mean, and isn't necessarily related to, the idea of them using conventional chemical warfare on a massive scale. They're a different thing. Um, so yes, and that, of course, disinformation war is always going to be there. But again, it's that thing. Most people talking about chemical and biological weapons in relation to that war have limited to no interest in biological chemical weapons as a thing. It's just another topic to discuss. And so I would say, generally speaking, it should be a marginal concern for most people. Pragmatically speaking, I think because of the tear gas attacks in Ukraine by Russian forces, it does make sense for the West to provide basic training in defense if it's needed. And obviously to provide things like gas masks and those types of things. And perhaps one of the advantages or positives that's come out of this early Russian experimentation with tear gas is that it's been a wake-up call for Ukraine. And if they are seen to be rapidly improving their CB defense, where's the incentive to use against troops? At least there isn't one. And so I think hopefully we won't necessarily see an escalation cycle there, because I think there may not be that much benefit from doing it. But unfortunately, I think low-scale use will continue.
Right. The last question for today's interview, Brett. Where do you see challenges that we might face in the future when we speak about chemical and biological weapons?
So, luckily, I think chemical and biological weapons are niche. I think often when we think about threats, we obviously backcast from what used to be threats in the old days and what threats we prepared for. I think chemical weapons, let's start there, is a wide range of different things, but the use of poison as part of terrorism has been with us for a long time. And there aren't really that many obstacles to committing terrorist attacks at lower scale or next to none. The more sophisticated attacks, it becomes more expensive, more complicated. But sadly, the reality is people commit terrorism in other ways. And so there's usually no real incentive to go down that route. In saying that, as time goes on, as technologies advance, certain characteristics of chemical weapons, be that the scale, cost, disruptive potential, political messaging, may tip the balance, and you may see groups turning towards that agent. It might not necessarily be a permanent thing. It might just be a short-term trope, but that happens. And so lowest scale sort of substate use is a concern. My major concern at the moment would be the fact that tear gas is illegal to use on the battlefield. And it's illegal to use because A, you can confuse it with other gases, which then means you accidentally start a tit for tat exchange of conventional munitions. Less of an issue today, because of course we wouldn't expect both sides to ever have them. But also because if a state starts stockpiling tear gas to use in conflict zones, where's the line between a tear gas and a more lethal agent, considering that tear gas can kill if used in certain ways, and more traditional older tear gases certainly can kill. You suddenly start to have this question of, it's the Trojan horse. You allow that in, everything's in. And so that's my concern. And this is why I've been very vocal on ensuring that the tear gas issue is called out. Not because I think in the Ukraine context, it's not the most important dimension of that warfare. You're not going to be able to prosecute Putin for it or anything like that. But historically, that incidents like this need to be seen to generate reputational cost, because if they don't, they could, that's the idea of you can potentially act cheaply now and save much cost later, would be my view. And that's why the tear gas issue is important. On the biological side, it's terrifying in a sense. There is endless potential to do these things. But again, there are obstacles. It's very unlikely you would choose biological agents as a weapon of choice compared to other things. And I think in both cases, both chemical and biological, where the real utility of these tends to be deniable forms grey area use. And I think that's what was reasserted to us by the Salisbury incident, DRU's use of chemical weapons, because all those forms of use tend to be communicative. And certainly something as weird necessarily as chemical and biological weapons are a very potent tool for communication. And I think that's where the danger of reemergence lies for them.
Brett, thank you very much for your insightful thoughts and ideas that you presented about the chemical and biological weapons. I think it's a very important topic, despite, as you said, we have two conventions, but still people are people, and we should, be careful about the future. And I would like to highlight your point about the terrorism, drones, new technology that is emerging and basically might be used with combination of those weapons. Anyway, thank you very much again for your remarks, and I wish you good journey in your research and academic life.